Greetings and salutations, everyone. This is Akil signing in again to share with you, this time, my thoughts on last night's decision by the grand jury in Ferguson, Missouri, not to indict Officer Darren Wilson for his fatal shooting of Michael Brown last August. This kind of topic is always difficult for me to address because there are always so many different dimensions to it that I think need to be addressed. If I have to start, to pick a place to start, I would have to choose the whole approach to reacting to these situations that you often see in the black community. Now, I remember I was actually lying in my hospital bed, as I mentioned on Facebook yesterday evening. I was lying in my hospital bed during a hospital stay last August when this whole controversy erupted over the shooting of Michael Brown. I remember my uncle was visiting me, and we were both watching news reports on CNN of the whole sort of spasm of outrage that had erupted after Michael Brown's shooting. I remember that my uncle made a comment that I thought was very wise. He said, folks who are reacting to what happened need to put less emphasis on this particular case and look more at the big picture. Because at the end of the day, the evidence pertaining to this particular incident is still murky. Now, this was maybe a week at the very most after Michael Brown's death. And so a lot of evidence was still emerging, was still being sought out, and a lot of supposed witnesses and other people who claimed to have knowledge of what happened that day were still coming forward. Some of them were still in the shadows. It really wasn't altogether clear what really happened on that day, what the circumstances surrounding Michael Brown's shooting really were. So my uncle said, look, we should definitely keep an eye on this situation and examine the evidence in it. But at the end of the day, if it turns out that the evidence is not conclusive enough, well, let me put it this way. There's a chance that the evidence will turn out to be too inconclusive or too unclear to justify pressing charges against this officer and bringing him to justice. That's not to say that the officer is actually objectively blameless in his conduct. It simply means that the evidence to prove his guilt might not be there or might not be solid enough to secure a conviction or even merely an indictment of him. And if that turns out to be the case, then a lot of people are going to be very bitterly disappointed and outraged by the outcome, and there'll only be that much more tension, that much more distrust between the black community and the police, and that much more of a rift between black America and white America, frankly. So my uncle said, look, we need to look at the bigger picture. We need to focus on a lot of the other incidents that go on in this country every day in which the evidence of police misconduct is a lot stronger, whether because there's video footage of the actual shootings or other cases of abuse and brutality, or for whatever other reason, where the evidence of police malfeasance is a lot clearer, a lot stronger, and where we have a much stronger leg to stand on in making the case for changes to the legal system that will hopefully deter police from engaging in misconduct in the first place and bring them to justice when they do engage in misconduct nonetheless. And I had to agree with him. I thought his point was entirely appropriate, and I still agree with it to this day. I can't say that I was surprised by the outcome of this grand jury investigation. I wasn't surprised by it one bit, and I'm far from the only person who reacted almost, not, well, I shouldn't say blasely, but who reacted without surprise to this outcome. This is the way it usually goes down. The legal system in this country is heavily weighted and biased in favor of police officers. The law that governs the use of deadly force by police officers is relatively permissive, as long as police officers in these situations subjectively believe, sincerely believe, or at least can plausibly claim that they sincerely believe that their lives or safety are in danger, they are allowed to use deadly force, at least if that belief is found to be objectively reasonable. Now, when you talk about the reasonableness criterion, that's where the biases of the flesh and blood human beings who run the justice system come into play. At the end of the day, any system ultimately comes down to people. people interacting with each other in certain ways and implementing certain practices and following and enforcing certain rules. And it just so happens that prosecutors, juries, and judges in this country are generally biased in favor of police, whether that's because they may be prejudiced based on race or any other criterion against the people who fall victim to police brutality, or whether it's because they simply sympathize with the difficulties of police work and the challenges that police officers face. Whatever the reasons may be, I think most Americans, frankly, are more likely to sympathize with police officers in these situations than with the people they often shoot down or beat up with nightsticks or what have you. At the end of the day, those biases on individuals' parts and the biases in the written laws that govern the use of force by police officers need to be addressed. We need to look at that big picture if we're actually going to make a positive impact on this situation. Now, I sympathize greatly with the outrage felt by a lot of the folks in Ferguson and elsewhere around the country and around the world who have reacted with shock and dismay to the outcome of this investigation. But let me say this. I myself have not followed in great detail all of the evidence, such as it is, that has emerged in this case. So I'm really not in a position to say for certain that the grand jury should have indicted Officer Wilson. I'm not in a position to say that they were right not to press charges against him either. I'm not really in a position to take either position firmly because I don't have the evidence, as of yet at least. I'm not familiar enough with the evidence that's been presented in the case to make that judgment. Now, that's pretty thin gruel for a lot of people. But the reality is, not every altercation between a police officer and a black or brown person that ends in the death of the latter or the injury of the latter is a situation of police brutality. I imagine probably most such encounters are cases of police brutality. But there are some such cases in which the police are using force justifiably. And so the key is to look at the evidence in each particular case and judge each case on its own merits. Now, there have been a lot of incidents in the past, racially charged controversies, in which folks inside and outside of the black community in particular reflexively sided with the African American complainant in the case. And not all of these cases even involve police, mind you. Sometimes it was a dispute between two or more private citizens across the color line. And there have been, a lot of these controversies in which folks inside and outside of the black community reflexively sided with the black person involved or people involved in the dispute, only to find out later that there was no evidence to support their side of the story, or that all the evidence in the case actually contradicted their version of the story. Back in the 80s, you had the Tawana Brawley case in which a black teenager in upstate New York disappeared from home for a couple of days, if memory serves, and then later showed up claiming that she had been raped by a group, I think, of police officers, or I think one of the people she accused was actually a prosecutor at the time. It turned out that all the evidence in her case militated against her version of the story, and there was no evidence to indicate the guilt of the people whom she accused. Al Sharpton made his bones as America's chief racial rabble-rouser by representing Miss Brawley in the public eye in that case. This was 1987 to 88. More recently, and this is a case that I remember very well myself, in 2006, you had the Duke Lacrosse rape hoax, in which Crystal Mangum, an African-American exotic dancer who had been hired with one of her partners, her co-workers, to dance and perform at a party held by members of Duke University's lacrosse team, ended up accusing several, I think 3 of the lacrosse players, of attacking, racially slurring, and raping her. Now, these players had their lives and good names and reputations dragged through the mud for almost a year after that allegation was first made, and you had students and faculty members on the Duke campus and on campuses nationwide, siding with Crystal Mangum without laying eyes on a shred of evidence. You had a prosecutor in that case, Mike Nifong, who was just an absolute disgrace to the entire legal profession, violated countless rules of procedure in order to try to smear these lacrosse players and make them out to be guilty. You had journalists and activists across the country and even in other countries Again, just reflexively taking Crystal Mangum's side, taking the accuser's side. What turned out to be the case? I'm not sure that many people who remember the beginning of that controversy were still paying attention by the end of it. And I know for a fact that the media did not give anywhere near as much coverage to the outcome of that case as they gave to the initiation of the case. Well, it wasn't until about a year later that I found out in the pages of The Economist magazine that the whole case had collapsed and that Crystal Mangum had completely fabricated the whole thing. It turned out that she had a history of making up false allegations of sexual assault in the past in order to get herself out of tight situations. She was suffering from at least one mental illness that escapes my memory at the moment. And right now, at present, in November 2014, she is cooling her heels in jail after having been found guilty of murdering her ex-boyfriend. This is someone who actually never really had any credibility. But because of a certain narrative that's at large in the country that stems from this country's tortured racial history, a lot of people reflexively took her side without actually looking at the evidence. So I'm more than willing to allow that, the failure to indict Darren Wilson in this case was an injustice. But I don't know that for a fact because I haven't analyzed the available evidence myself. And until and unless I can do that, I can't firmly come down on the side of those who are outraged at the outcome of this case. And neither should anyone else. I will say this, though. Let's operate from the premise that this was an injustice, that Darren Wilson should have been indicted for killing Michael Brown, that the fact that he's gotten clean away with it is not right, that he was not justified in his use of force against Michael Brown. I still have to, beg to differ with a lot of the violent reactions that a minority of the protesters in Ferguson and elsewhere, mainly Ferguson at this point, have employed to express their discontent. Now, I've gotten into arguments, again, obviously on Facebook, with a number of friends and other acquaintances of mine about, just how warranted those reactions are. The outrage is totally understandable, and people have every right to express that outrage peacefully and nonviolently. When it comes to getting into scuffles with the police, rioting, looting, damaging the other people's property, all of that is totally wrong. It's wrong in principle because it ends up victimizing people, property owners, business owners, and the like, innocent bystanders who had nothing to do with the original injustice. None of the people whose property has been destroyed or damaged in the reactions to the original shooting or to this grand jury decision, none of those people shot Michael Brown. None of them played any role in the actual injustice that folks are trying to protest. What's more, those violent reactions are self-defeating for the community. One of the things I've pointed out in my reactions to this issue so far is that, the historical record does not support the use of violence as a means of expressing the black community's grievances about police brutality. For at least 50 years now, race riots in America have typically consisted of members of the black community lashing out violently at some perceived or real racial injustice, usually involving police brutality, or at least alleged police brutality. One of the first major race riots of the 1960s was the Harlem Riot of 1964, 50 years ago. And, a slew of race riots across the country followed over the next several years. Since then, we've seen other race riots in other contexts. The Liberty City riots in Miami in 1980, which also involved the killing of a black man by police. The Los Angeles riots of 1992. I remember riots over police brutality in Cincinnati, Ohio in 2001. And now, the most recent case, what's happened in Ferguson. Name me one, just one of those situations in which the violence actually got anything useful done. I can't think of any of them. I live here in Washington, D.C. I remember having a conversation with an acquaintance at one of the, policy discussion events that are ubiquitous in this city. And he mentioned that he used to live in Columbia Heights in the last decade, in the 2000s. And he remembers walking past a building that was a burnt-out husk from the riots after Dr. King, Martin Luther King, was assassinated in April 1968. That building was still a burnt-out husk in 2008. There was rubble left over from the post-King assassination riots in Washington, D.C. 40 years later. You had a relatively well-to-do black middle class that was decimated by the riots, Those of them who could escape escaped along with a torrent of white flight and capital flight from the city that resulted from the riots. The crime rate went up. Insurance rates skyrocketed because it became so much riskier for insurers to cover people in this neck of the woods. I mean, the city as a whole, and particularly the city's black community, took decades to recover from those riots. And then, of course, let's not forget that in the short run, in an immediate sense, all that these violent outbursts do is give the police that much more of an excuse to break black heads. Okay? Anytime there's a violent reaction to these kinds of incidents, I don't think any good can come of it. The main likelihood that I see, if the violence or the riots have any impact at all, is that they will increase the black body count by bringing the wrath of the police down on black communities. These violent outbursts don't do anyone any good, and the people they hurt the most are us. Not white folks, definitely not the police, except maybe for some police officers who may be injured in the altercations. The people to whom they do the most damage are us. They're totally pointless, useless, self-defeating. So, I've heard friends and acquaintances of mine admonish me for encouraging people to calm down and to try to let cooler heads prevail and to look at the big picture and focus on the long-term struggle to change this nation's unjust laws as they relate to police brutality and the use of force by police generally. People have told me it's not realistic to expect people to take that long view in the heat of the moment. I understand that. Like I said, I understand the outrage. I sympathize with it to a large extent. And frankly, again, assuming that the evidence does indicate that, there really should have been charges in this case against Darren Wilson, I totally agree with the outrage. And I respect and support people's right to express that outrage peacefully. But when people start lashing out at the police, throwing bricks, breaking windows, looting stores, lighting cars and buildings on fire, that's no good. And I feel that I and others in the community have to speak out against that, if only because it damages us. It hurts us more than anyone else. Okay? Some of the arguments I've heard to the contrary since yesterday evening's news have included the point that, for example, a lot of the reactions by mainstream white America to the outrage in this case have been callous and even prejudiced reactions. My answer to that is, well, do you think white America is going to react any less callously to outbursts of violence on the part of black people? Or, by contrast, do you think that white America, if anything, will react more callously to those outbursts because they will only reinforce centuries-old stereotypes about how black people are rowdy and irrational and out of control? Which do you think is the more likely outcome of these outbursts of violence? Obviously, the latter outcome is much more likely. Obviously, these outbursts are just likely to perpetuate and reinforce those harmful stereotypes, which in turn will only lead to more episodes of violence against black communities, particularly by police. So I have to say that, my urging is that people calm down as best they can and try to take the long view of the situation. Those exhortations stand. May not work, they may fall on deaf ears, but someone's got to say it. People have been saying it. The family of Michael Brown himself, they've been saying it. They've been calling for these protests to remain as peaceful as possible, and rightly so. Al Sharpton himself said at Michael Brown's funeral that people who try to pop off and start and commit acts of violence because of their outrage at this situation are totally in the wrong, especially given that they were not acquainted personally with Michael Brown. If his family, his actual loved ones, can stay nonviolent and peaceful in their expressions of outrage and protest, why can't people who never met Michael Brown do the same thing? I have to agree. I thought that was very good talk on Reverend Sharpton's part. So at the end of the day, cooler heads do need to prevail. I understand the outrage. I sympathize with it. I respect it. But at the end of the day, it's still wrong. It's futile and it's self-defeating. We've got to do better than this. We're not doing ourselves or anyone else any favors by taking to the streets in that manner, in a violent manner. So that's my take on this situation so far, and I'm sure you can look forward to further commentary from me as the aftermath of this grand jury decision unfolds. Looking forward to hearing your comments, ladies and gents. Take care, and let's increase the peace.